A crime against the people of Mosul. A senior US general blasts the Islamic State group for blowing up the city's iconic mosque. But IS says the US-led coalition is behind the strike. France unveils its new government after a cabinet reshuffle that saw 3 high-profile resignations. Macron's new team has as many women as men. And the state crown swapped for a hat. A subdued Queen's speech focused on Brexit reflects the mood of a UK still reeling from attacks and a deadly high-rise tower fire. Hello, good to have you with us. I'm Belle Lupton here with a roundup of the news from across the globe. And we begin in Iraq with the destruction of Mosul's iconic leaning minaret and its adjoining mosque. The city is 9 months into a battle to reclaim it from the Islamic State group. Both IS and the US-led international coalition are pointing the finger at the other for the strike on the Grand Al-Nouri Mosque. Rodaba Abbas reports on why the medieval site is so important.
This mosque, with its iconic leaning minaret, was viewed as a coveted symbolic prize for US-backed Iraqi troops in the fight to retake Mosul from the Islamic State group. But now Iraq's Ministry of Defense says the group's fighters have destroyed the iconic Al-Nouri Mosque themselves by detonating it with explosives. It was here that the group's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared his self-styled caliphate in June 2014. Mosul is Iraq's second largest city and has remained the group's last urban bastion in the country. The battle for US-backed Iraqi troops has been long and complicated. They have been relentlessly fighting for 8 months. The extremists are now expected to take their last stand in the old city. The area is a densely populated quarter with narrow, winding alleys. It's estimated at least 100,000 civilians are trapped inside. The United Nations has described their situation as desperate.
Well, earlier we spoke to journalist Owen Holdaway, who's in nearby Erbil.
A very difficult position. They have somewhat done with their propaganda. They've been pushing forward the idea of the caliphate can be in the mind of their soldiers. You know, so they're actually trying to get away from the fact of the so-called Islamic State and maybe revert to maybe an organisation that they were before al-Baghdadi actually declared the caliphate. So it was extremely difficult for what they were going to do. But the problem as well, I think, is the fact that they blow up this mosque, which does have such a symbolic value. It does still dent the idea and dent the idea of them having actually a so-called a caliphate going forward. I mean, taking the mosque is obviously very symbolic. There's still certain areas of the old quarter which they've got their presence in a few other districts. When ICTF were moving in and taking the mosque, they essentially created a long corridor from the east, and then they surrounded it that way and then moved in. So there are still other areas. I mean, the area of the old quarter is extremely densely populated, and the houses are, very narrow. So going forward, they've still got to do a lot of house-to-house clearance to finish off the remaining Daesh fighters left within the city.
Well, across the border, Syrian defence forces are closing in on Islamic State group fighters in the city of Raqqa. The fighting has been bloody, with IS using drones and booby traps to slow down their enemy. France 24's James Andre has been travelling with a group of Syrian Defence Force fighters. Here he is.
The situation over the past 24 hours has changed a little bit. Yesterday we were inside the centre, close to the centre of Raqqa, with a group of fighters holding a position for the Syrian Democratic Forces. Today these people have been attacked. The group that is holding the neighbourhood of Romania were attacked by a group of Islamic State fighters, Islamic State group fighters. There were a few small groups of fighters, 5 to 7 fighters. They managed to stop them, and then the Islamic group militants used a car bomb, as well as two suicide bombers. Now, two fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces were hurt in these clashes, but what's for sure is that indeed means that there is a counterattack, that ISIS has not decided strictly to defend the actual hypercenter of the city, but they are also fighting back in the suburbs. So indeed, a lot of pressure here on these fighters who are taking care of these positions inside the city.
Our correspondent James Andre in Raqqa there. We're here in France. Emmanuel Macron's chief of staff has announced the country's new cabinet after a reshuffle that involved more changes than originally expected. The ceremony comes just 3 days after Macron's newly formed party won a majority in parliamentary elections and after 3 high-profile resignations over scandals, all part of Macron's pledge to clean up politics. Catherine Clifford takes a look at France's new cabinet.
Little known names among a new lineup for President Macron's cabinet. Florence Parly, a former executive and budget official, was announced as the new defense minister, and Nicole Belloubet, a member of the Constitutional Court, as justice minister. Meanwhile, former Senator Jacques Mézard was moved from agriculture to territorial planning. Several leading posts didn't change, including the foreign, finance and interior portfolios. The reshuffle had been on the cards after Macron's République on the Move party won a majority in Sunday's parliamentary election. But following the resignation of several key ministers, there were more changes than expected. A few hours earlier, former Justice Minister François Bayrou was forced to resign alongside 2 other centrist Modem party ministers amid a party scandal. Bayrou and Modem's importance as an ally to Macron has lessened after his Républicain on the Move party won its parliamentary majority. All this came just days after Macron asked former minister and key ally Richard Ferrand, who's in the midst of a conflict of interest scandal, to leave his post. The president's keen to distance the government from such affairs after he built his campaign on cleaning up French politics.
Well, as Macron's new government comes together, France's Conservative Party is drifting apart. After the Les Républicains' losses in Sunday's parliamentary elections, a movement within the party is threatening to break away. Alexander Orcott explains.
The cracks in the party have turned into a chasm, as Les Républicains MP Thierry Solère announced the creation of a new group in Parliament.
This group will bring together Les Républicains MPs, UDI MPs and independent MPs who we know are part of the right and the centre-right, and who will share with us the willingness to work together towards the common good in the National Assembly, to put political practices before all partisan considerations.
The self-titled Constructives are made up of around 20 Les Républicains MPs and around 15 from the centrist UDI party that's chosen to take part in this project. The UDI leader explained its objectives.
We'll break away from the old political world, from this kind of systematic opposition by reflex, by Pavlovian conditioning to all the government's proposals, even when the Prime Minister is a member of our political family, and even sometimes to oppose what we proposed yesterday. We don't want this kind of politics.
But hardliners from Les Républicains party were quick to dismiss the new group and want to play no part in it.
The constructives are behaving like they're the only ones who are constructive. It's a marketing term. I'd rather call them the opportunists, without conviction. They've played against our candidates and have made our candidates lose and have drifted away. So I'm not sorry to see them leave.
On the other side of the divide, this morning, traditionalist Les Républicains MPs re-elected Christian Jacob to lead their group in Parliament.
The UK's reigning monarch has delivered her annual Queen's Speech at the official opening of Parliament. This year's speech, which is written by government ministers, focused overwhelmingly on Brexit. The usual pomp was scaled back amidst concerns the ceremony would be overshadowed by protests over conditions that allowed the Grenfell Tower fire, which killed more than 79 people last week. Martin Pollard has the details.
The Queen was the centre of attention, but it's the necks of the Prime Minister and her government colleagues that are on the line. That's something Theresa May was reminded of as she left 10 Downing Street to hear the speech.
Your first and last Queen's speech, Prime Minister.
According to the Constitution, Queen Elizabeth's speech outlined the government's plans for the new Parliament. As expected, the speech was Brexit-centred. 8 of 27 bills that the Queen mentioned deal with the process of Britain's divorce from the EU.
My government's priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the European Union. My ministers are committed to working with Parliament, the devolved administrations, business and others to build the widest possible consensus on the country's future outside the European Union.
Plans on the domestic front include increasing the national living wage and reviewing the country's counter-terrorism strategy. But the speech was most notable for what was missing. Gone were controversial policies mentioned in the Prime Minister's election campaign, such as the changes to funding for the elderly. There was also no mention of President Donald Trump's invitation for a state visit, which sparked widespread criticism. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn promised to introduce substantial amendments to the speech. The speech will go to a vote in Parliament next week. For the government's version to get MPs' approval, it will likely need the support of 10 MPs from the DUP party. But a deal between the DUP and the Conservatives is not yet certain.
Well, our correspondent in London is Duncan Woodside. We spoke to him earlier about Theresa May's efforts to thrash out an agreement with Ireland's DUP party after her Conservative party failed to win a majority in a general election 2 weeks ago.
There are reports that the Democratic Unionists are demanding a king's ransom in order to get into bed with the Conservative government. There are reports that £1 billion, that's more than €1 billion, has been requested for infrastructure in Northern Ireland, and another £1 billion to be spent on another area of policy which the Democratic Unionist Party is favourable towards. So very big figures, lots of money being talked about in order to assist Northern Ireland and presumably also massively benefit the Democratic Unionist Party's popularity within Northern Ireland. A lot of debate ahead still. It's clear that the Democratic Unionists are playing hardball, but they do at the moment have a very strong hand, because without the support of the Democratic Unionists, this government can't really get off the ground.
Duncan Woodside in London there. South Sudan is no longer technically in famine. That's according to a new report by the government and the UN. But that doesn't mean the region is in food security. Millions of people are still on the brink of starvation. More than 3 years of civil war have damaged food supplies, and despite an influx of aid since March, half the population is expecting to face a food emergency this month. Many regions risk slipping back into famine if that flow of aid stops. And finally, it's become an international exercise craze, combining physical with spiritual discipline. So it's hardly surprising that yoga would have its own day of celebration. And for the 3rd International Yoga Day, we're taking you to where it all began, India. There we go, 50,000 people there joining the Prime Minister for an outdoor yoga session, not letting a few spots of rain dampen their spirits either. Narendra Modi has, of course, been pushing for yoga to be celebrated worldwide, and that session was echoed by mass yoga sessions all over the globe. Not here in Paris, though, where it's possibly been a bit too hot for yoga. Well, that's all we've got time for this edition, but I'll be back in 15 minutes with another roundup for you. If you can't wait till then, don't forget you can get all the latest on our website. That's www.france24.com. Our top story and plenty more on there, as you can see, the cabinet reshuffle riding high on that website. I'll be back in 15 minutes. See you then.